So this video is about the Indo-Pakistan conflict. Before we go to the main question that I'll be discussing for the rest of the video, a brief overview of the Indo-Pakistan conflict. It was between 1947 and 1971, and it was a time of high tension between India and Pakistan, which resulted in three main wars. The first one was immediately after India and Pakistan gained independence from Britain, and it was over the India-ruled state of Kashmir and Jammu with a high Muslim population. This was called the First Kashmir War. The second one was also over Jammu and Kashmir. The third one was over the split between East and West Pakistan, with East Pakistan becoming the country of Bangladesh that we now know today. So now on to the question that I will be discussing. To what extent were the Indo-Pakistan conflicts rooted in Hindu-Muslim tensions? Okay, so more than the religious tensions or the Hindu-Muslim tensions themselves, it was caused by or created because the two groups were separated through a clear distinction. The conflicts themselves weren't caused because one religion didn't like the practices of another, or because one religion's practices went against the practices of another religion. The conflicts occurred because there were two groups of people in India at the time of the British rule, which the British helped play up this clear divide and caused a lot of separation between the two groups. And with the separation came a lot of hatred, anger, fear that one was going to take over the other, that one had more power than the other. So it was just basically two groups of people. And the grouping became so separated, so far apart, that over time the people became more angry and more violent towards one another. And I think that the Indo-Pakistan conflict wasn't based on very religious reasons, because if the two sides or the two groups of people were divided not because of a racial issue, or because their skin colors were different, because their hair colors were different, because their eye colors were different, I feel like the conflict itself wouldn't have changed a lot. So this is why, rather than it being a religious tension and religious conflict, it's more two separated groups having a very distinct divide. So this separation, where did it start? Well, we can see that it originated after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. At this time, the British East India Company ruled over, or had a lot of control over, India. And so however, the Indian people, the people of all religions in India, classes, castes, felt very oppressed and disrespected by the agents of British East India. They did not like any of the differences in laws or rules that were caused by the British East India. Royal families were angry because the British made changes to the inheritance law, which made adopted children ineligible for their thrones. Wealthy landowners joined the fight as well, because the British East India took away or seized their land, and then they gave it to the poor. However, the poor were not happy with the British rule either. They thought that the British imposed high land taxes upon them. The British also tried changing some religious and some very social issues. So the British tried to ban the caste system and the sati, which was widow burning at the time. And British missionaries started to preach Christianity to Hindu and Muslims, which both these religions, Hindu and Muslim, thought that their religion was being attacked because of this. So over time, these tensions and hatred grew, which led to the Indian people being very angry at the British, so they decided to rebel. There were many rebellions and revolts that occurred all over India. However, the end result was not what the Indians wanted. In fact, it was very much the opposite. In August of 1958, the Government of India Act of 1858 ended the British East India Company. The British government took direct control of India, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. So not only did Britain not leave the Indians alone, they got more control of India, which led to more unhappiness for the Indians. And it was not until 90 years later, in 1947, that they finally got their independence from Britain. But in the meantime, the British quickly learned that a united Indian population was one that they could not rule for a very long period of time, because they understood that a united population meant more rebellions, just like the one that they just faced, because the population was clearly angry by their rule and did not want the British in India. So the British came up with this method of divide and rule. They wanted the population divided, because then the two groups, or the divided groups, would fight over one another and not with the British, leaving them greater control of the country. So the British wanted to divide the population, and what better way to do it than dividing a population that already had some differences. At the time, the Muslims were a minority in India, with Hindus being the majority, and although these two groups these two groups at the time were not very violent towards one another. They obviously had the best of terms, but they were not enemies. They did not mistrust one another. But the British saw this difference as an opportunity to divide the people. But they did not know that this divide would cause such tensions seen even today. So the British started creating communal tensions. They polarized the population. Obviously, this wasn't done overnight. It was a very gradual process, but because it was so gradual, it slowly infected almost like everyone in India. And it caused a lot of mutual distrust between Hindus and Muslims, because the British played the role of the Muslims being a minority, so they weren't getting equal representation. They weren't getting the same freedoms as the Hindus. This was not true in most cases at the time, but the British used the few instances that they saw to their advantage to create this role of the struggling minority. The Muslims quickly became attached to this ideal. Both tensions grew high, and at this time, the All India Muslim League was created. This party was created with good intentions. They wanted to correct the system from within, give Muslims equal representation. And it was finally thought that, people finally thought that there would be no more divide between the Muslims and Hindus in India. However, once the politicians got the power, got a taste for the power, they wanted an independent country, an independent state for the Muslims. This obviously did not help solve the divide. It increased it by a lot, which is exactly what the British wanted. But talk of a new country created an independence movement, which eventually led to India's independence in 1947. But the divide did not stop there. Then the Muslims brought back the idea of having a different country. And this demand was finally met. Pakistan was formed, but the distrust, the anger, the hatred, and because of such clear separation, could not be taken away. And violence broke out constantly. And there was a hatred in the people that they just didn't know why it occurred, but they just saw it occur, and the violence increased but never decreased. So this led to the Indo-Pakistan conflict for the next almost 30 years. And even today, the tensions still remain high between India and Pakistan, still over the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and obviously other reasons as well. Again, as I mentioned before, I don't think it was rooted necessarily in the religious tensions themselves, but rather and not in the separation of their religious values necessarily, but because they were just two people separated in such a clear and manner that they were never able to be brought back together. And the hatred that started out small has now grown over the many, many thousands and millions of lives lost over these reasons, which has increased the hatred but never decreased it and never united the people again. So that is my question to the answer, and that is it.